Hello, and welcome back to Horror Stories Audio. For our returning listeners, thank you for stepping back into the shadows with us. We appreciate your courage in facing the unknown that waits here. Tonight, our story takes us to a place the maps have forgotten. A secluded patch of earth where the silence has a voice of its own and the trees hold secrets older than memory. Find a quiet space. Turn down your lights. Settle in and prepare yourself. If you enjoy the cold, thrilling embrace of fear, consider taking a moment to like this story and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps the darkness find others like us, gathering fellow travelers for our weekly descent into madness. The story opens with Leo's long, lonely drive into the deep embrace of Blackwood National Forest. The asphalt had surrendered to gravel miles back, and now his old pickup truck crawled along a dirt track hemmed in by ancient moss-covered pines and solemn hemlocks. They stood like silent, judgmental giants, their dense canopy swallowing the afternoon sun and plunging the path into a perpetual green-tinted twilight. The air itself seemed to grow heavy and thick, filled with the loamy scent of decay and damp earth. Inside the cab, the world felt small and suffocating. A faded, pine-shaped air freshener, a silly $2 gift from Clara, dangled motionless from the rearview mirror, its artificial scent long dead. He'd look at it, then his eyes would inevitably drift to the empty passenger seat beside him, a hollow space that felt heavier and more solid than a person. He could trace the faint, worn patterns on the upholstery, remembering the way she used to sit, with her feet tucked up underneath her as she watched the world go by. The classic rock station he'd been clinging to for the last hour, a tenuous, crackling link to civilization, finally surrendered to the wilderness. The familiar guitar riffs dissolved into a cascade of sharp pops and a deep, hissing static. He reached out and turned the knob, plunging the cab into a thick, unnerving silence that was broken only by the rhythmic crunch of tires on dirt and the pounding of blood in his own ears. He finally arrived at a campsite by a clear, babbling creek, and the sight of it was a fresh wound. It was painfully perfect. Sunlight, thick and golden, speared through the canopy to illuminate a small, level clearing of soft moss and fallen pine needles. The water whispered over smooth, gray stones, a sound that should have been peaceful but instead felt like a mockery of the silence in his own soul. This was the exact spot she would have chosen, a place teeming with quiet life that only served to highlight his own internal death. Being here without her felt like a sacrilege. To fight the paralysis that threatened to take hold, he began to set up his gear with an obsessive, almost frantic precision. This was not a pleasant camp chore. It was a desperate act of war against the chaos in his own mind, a defense against the grief that threatened to drown him. He unrolled the tent, the nylon whispering against the ground like a final secret. He slotted the aluminum poles together, the clean metallic click of each section a small, satisfying victory of order in a world that had none. He didn't just hammer the stakes into the ground. He measured their spacing with his boot, ensuring they were perfectly symmetrical, driving each one deep into the rich earth with powerful, rhythmic blows from a rubber mallet. He pulled the guy lines taut, testing their tension with his fingertips until they hummed with a low, resonant frequency. Every piece of equipment, from his stove to his water filter, was laid out on a small tarp in a perfect, rigid grid. For these few fleeting moments, this small patch of the forest was a world he could control, an island of logic in an ocean of pain. As night fell, a deep and total darkness consumed the clearing, a blackness so complete it felt like a physical substance pressing in from all sides. To ward it off, Leo built a campfire. He worked methodically, almost reverently, arranging the kindling and logs in a neat pyramid. The damp wood hissed and smoked, refusing to catch, a frustrating mirror of his own failing spirit. He struck the ferro rod again and again, sending showers of sparks into the gloom until finally, a tiny flame licked at the wood, hesitated, and then bloomed into a steady crackling fire. It was a small, defiant circle of warmth and light against the immense cold indifference of the woods, and Leo huddled closer to it as if it were the last friendly thing on earth. He stared into the heart of the blaze, watching the flames writhe and twist. The way they danced, casting shifting, distorted shadows on the wall of trees that surrounded him, was hypnotic. In the flickering light, the woods didn't seem empty, but filled with silent, watching shapes. This hypnotic dance of light and shadow triggered a specific, detailed flashback, pulling him from the cold reality of the forest with an irresistible force. Suddenly, he was back in their living room, the biting scent of pine and wood smoke replaced by the familiar, comforting smell of old books and Clara's coffee. A large, crinkled topographical map was spread across their living room floor, held down at the corners by coasters and whatever books were handy. This was from a night about a year ago, a night he and Clara had planned this very trip. He remembered her on her hands and knees over the map, her hair tied back in a messy bun, her face illuminated by the soft glow of a floor lamp. "Here," she had said, her voice electric with an excitement that was uniquely hers, tapping a finger on a dense green patch of the map. "Blackwood National Forest. This is where we have to go." He had smiled then, leaning over her shoulder. "Blackwood? What's so special about that one? It's just more trees, isn't it?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide and deadly serious. "No, it's not just trees. It's where my grandpa worked, back when he was young, logging in the summers. He used to tell me stories, Leo." She lowered her voice, as if sharing a sacred secret. "He said the trees in the heart of the forest were as old as the moon. He told me about hidden waterfalls that weren't on any map and a silence so deep you could hear the world turning. He said there was a magic there, a feeling you couldn't find anywhere else on Earth. For her, Blackwood was special, a place of myth and family history, a tangible link to a past she cherished." A loud snap from a log in the fire, spitting a shower of embers into the air, shattered the memory. He was yanked back to the cold, lonely present. The warmth of the memory vanished instantly, leaving an ache in his chest that was worse than the physical chill in the air. He was here, in her sacred place, but he was alone. This flashback, this phantom limb of a life that was gone, established the deep emotional stakes of this location. He wasn't just in the woods. He was a ghost haunting the grounds of his own stolen future. Leo's first full day in the woods began with a cold, gray light filtering through the tent. The memory of the campfire, and of Clara's voice, clung to him like a shroud, making the silence of the morning feel heavy and significant. He knew he had to move, to do something other than sit and steep in his own sorrow. He forced himself to hike, pulling on his boots and heading down a barely there trail that followed the lazy curve of the creek. His goal was simple: to establish a baseline of normalcy. He needed to prove to himself that this was just a forest, a collection of trees and animals, not a living monument to his loss. He began observing the mundane beauty of the forest with the intense focus of a scientist trying to solve a problem. He cataloged the sounds and sights, collecting them like data. He watched a pair of blue jays squabble and chase each other through the high branches, their raucous, almost metallic calls echoing in the quiet air. A sudden rustle in the undergrowth revealed a fat, gray squirrel, its cheeks comically stuffed with acorns, chattering at him indignantly before skittering up the rough bark of an oak tree. He knelt by the creek and watched iridescent dragonflies hover over the water, their wings a blur of motion, before darting away with impossible speed. He noted the low, industrious hum of insects in the patches of sun that broke through the canopy, and took a moment to admire the intricate, dew-kissed geometry of a spider's web strung between two ferns. Every one of these small details was a piece of evidence, proof of a world that was ordinary, predictable, and functioning. And for a while, it worked. The tranquility was calming. The predictable, cyclical life of the woods was a balm on his frayed nerves. Here, There was no past or future, only the eternal present of sun, water, and trees. The simple reality of it was grounding, but the longer he walked, the more that same tranquility began to feel mocking. Every cheerful bird song was a note she wasn't there to hear. Every beautiful sight, the way the light hit a waterfall, the deep green of the moss on a fallen log, was a shared moment that would now never happen. The vibrant, unthinking life all around him was a stark, cruel contrast to the hollowness he carried inside. The peace of the forest was not his peace. It belonged to a world she was no longer a part of, and he was just a trespasser in it. He returned to his campsite hours later, the baseline of normalcy established, but at a cost. The forest was real, it was normal, and it was beautiful, and he had never felt more alone. On his way back from the mentally taxing hike, Leo's trail took him past the main ranger station. The same old park ranger was on the porch in a deeply worn rocking chair, methodically whittling a piece of wood with a small, sharp knife. A grizzled hound whose fur was the same color as the dusty porch boards slept at his feet. As Leo gave a polite nod and started to pass, the ranger looked up, his pale blue eyes sharp and discerning under a thicket of white eyebrows. "Hold up a minute, son," he rasped, his voice like stones grinding together. "You're the fella camping solo down by Miller's Creek, ain't ya?" Leo paused, admitting that he was. The ranger's hand stilled, and he gave Leo a long, appraising look that seemed to take in his city clothes and the exhaustion on his face. "That's a pretty spot," the ranger said slowly. "But it's got a history. Can get a little strange down there sometimes." He gestured with his knife toward a tin coffee pot on a small table. "Care for a cup? It's fresh, and you look like you could use it." Leo, feeling a sudden need for some brief human contact, accepted and sat on the porch steps as the old man poured a thick, black liquid into a chipped ceramic mug that smelled of 1,000 past coffees. "Like I said, history," the ranger began again, settling back into his chair. Instead of just a brief, cryptic comment, he started to share a piece of local folklore, his eyes looking past Leo and into the deep, unblinking woods. "It's probably nothing," he said, a phrase that made Leo's skin prickle. "Just an old story we tell to keep folks on the trail. But decades ago, back in the early 70s, a young woman vanished from a campsite almost exactly where you are now. Her name was Evelyn. A student, I think, from the city, out here painting landscapes. A huge search went on for weeks. I was just a boy then, but I remember it. They found her camp, her wallet, her easel with a half-finished painting still on it, but not a trace of her. It was like the woods just swallowed her whole." He paused, staring out at the trees as if he could still see the search parties moving through them. The only thing they ever found that was out of place was a single blue ribbon, the kind a woman might wear in her hair. It was tied neatly in a perfect, elaborate bow around an alder branch, right over the creek, dangling just above the water where it would catch the light. They took it down, of course, logged it as evidence. But the old-timers who've lived here their whole lives, their fathers and their fathers before them, they swear that every few years a new ribbon appears in the same spot. Different color, sometimes, but always a ribbon. I don't put much stock in it myself, but it's a story." He looked at Leo then, his gaze sharp and serious. "So, you be careful down there. It's a beautiful place, but it has a long memory. That's why I tell folks to be sure to remember where you put your things." The ranger's casual warning now had a chilling backstory. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "This forest, it has a way of rearranging things when you're not looking." Leo thanked him for the coffee and the story, offering a polite but skeptical smile. As he walked away, the tale echoed in his mind. A tragic story, to be sure. A cautionary tale about the dangers of the wilderness. But to his rational mind, it was just that, a story. A sad, unsolved mystery from a time long past, embellished by years of small-town gossip. It couldn't be anything more. That night, after the unsettling conversation with the ranger, Leo fell into an exhausted sleep, a deep and dreamless void brought on by physical and emotional fatigue. He woke the next morning slowly, pulled from the depths not by a sound but by a persistent sense of wrongness. The air in the tent felt colder, damper. The morning light, filtering through the thin nylon, was brighter and had a different color, a pale white instead of the usual green-tinted glow he'd grown used to in the clearing. Disoriented, his mind still thick with sleep, he sat, take up and unzipped the tent flap, expecting to see the familiar black ring of his campfire. Instead, the gentle lapping sound of the creek was right there, just a few feet away. His brain struggled to process the information. He blinked, then slowly turned his head to look back over his shoulder. The sight sent a jolt of ice water through his veins, snapping him into full, heart-pounding alertness. 50 yards away, sitting in the clearing where he had originally made his camp, was his fire pit, his blue cooler, and his lone folding chair. His entire tent, with him inside it, had been moved to a small, sandy bank at the very edge of the creek. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He scrambled out of the tent, his bare feet sinking into the soft, wet sand of the creek bank. His heart hammered against his ribs as he began a frantic, meticulous search for an explanation. He circled the tent once, then twice, his eyes scanning every inch of the ground. Nothing. He got down on his hands and knees, peering at the damp earth as if he could will a clue into existence. The utter lack of evidence was absolute and terrifying. There were no footprints, not his, not anyone else's. There were no drag marks in the sand or the mossy soil leading from the original campsite. The ground was pristine, as if the tent had been plucked from the sky by a giant invisible hand and set down with impossible delicacy. His mind reeled, grasping for a logical foothold. For a fleeting second, he dismissed the ranger's tale of the vanishing woman and the ribbon. His rational mind refused to connect this event with some small-town ghost story. He tried to rationalize it. Pranksters? He scanned the entire perimeter again. There were no tracks leading in or out of the area. And how could anyone move a staked tent with a 180-pound man inside without making a single sound? Impossible. Could he have sleepwalked? He looked at his hands and feet. They were clean. The stakes were still driven firmly into the ground. No single person could have done this. A flash flood? A mudslide? The rest of the campsite, 50 yards away, was completely untouched. Every logical explanation he constructed crumbled into dust against the impossible, terrifying puzzle before him. The silence, the complete lack of any evidence at all, was the most horrifying clue. The day after the first move was a long, silent war waged inside Leo's head. The raw, primal fear from the morning fought against every logical instinct he possessed. Part of him, a screaming, terrified part, urged him to abandon everything: the tent, the truck, Clara's memory, and just run until he hit asphalt. But another, stronger part, the engineering mind that had governed his entire adult life, refused to flee. He would not be defeated by an unsolved variable. He would not be scared away by a trick. As the hours passed, his fear slowly cooled and hardened into a cold, sharp anger. This was a puzzle, a problem of physics and force, and he would solve it. He made the decision to stay, not out of bravery, but out of a stubborn, defiant refusal to let the irrational win. Driven by this newfound resolve, his engineering mind took over completely. He would not be a passive victim in the woods. He would be a scientist in his lab. He meticulously began to turn his campsite into an experiment, a carefully controlled environment designed for one purpose: to catch what he had now forced himself to assume were clever and malicious human pranksters. First, he moved the tent back to its exact original spot, using his own feet to measure the distance from the fire pit and a large, recognizable oak tree, creating a mental grid. This was his control variable. Then, he began fortifying his position. He didn't just place the tent stakes, he drove them deep into the ground with the back of a hatchet, grunting with the effort, angling them for maximum resistance. Next came his makeshift alarm system. He unspooled a long length of thin, strong fishing line. He tied one end with a perfect slip knot to the tent's main zipper pull. From there, he carefully threaded the almost invisible line in a low perimeter around the tent, looping it around tree trunks and sturdy roots about 6 inches off the ground. The final part of the line was attached to a pyramid of empty bean cans he had carefully balanced on the very edge of his cooler. The slightest disturbance to the line or the zipper would send the cans crashing to the ground with a deafening clatter. It was a makeshift but elegant solution. His final tool was his smartphone. He cleared its memory, deleting old photos and videos to ensure there was enough space for a full night of recording. He plugged it into a fully charged portable battery pack and propped it up inside the tent on a bundle of clothes, aiming the camera lens out the mesh window. He adjusted the angle a dozen times until the field of view perfectly covered the zipper in the area directly in front of the tent. He even went a step further. He used a flat piece of bark to meticulously smooth the soft earth in a 5-foot circle around the tent, creating a perfect, undisturbed canvas of dirt. Any footprint, any mark at all, would be immediately obvious. As he worked, a sense of control returned to him. Each knot tied, each stake driven, was an affirmation of logic. He was a man of science, and he was using its principles to expose a fraud, to document what he believed was a human act. By the time dusk fell, his camp was no longer a place of fear, but a carefully constructed trap. He felt a grim satisfaction. Let them come, he thought. This time, I'll be ready. His traps were set, but Leo's obsessive mind couldn't rest. Waiting was not enough. Convinced his adversaries were human, he began obsessively searching for clues of their passage. He spent the better part of the morning on his hands and knees, methodically examining the ground in ever-widening circles from his camp. He was looking for a dropped candy wrapper, a cigarette butt, a single clear footprint, anything to confirm his theory and prove he wasn't going mad. The search was a way to keep his hands and mind busy, a physical task to distract from the cold, illogical fear that threatened to surface. It was near the edge of the clearing, almost completely swallowed by the undergrowth, that he found it. It wasn't a real path, but the ghost of one. A faint, overgrown trail leading away from his campsite and deeper into the woods. A few bent branches, some unnaturally flattened moss. A sense that something had passed this way more than once. It was almost invisible, but to his focused, desperate eyes, it was a clear sign. This had to be their way in, their secret route. Hoping for answers, he followed it. The trail was difficult, forcing him to duck under low-hanging, sticky pine boughs and push through thorny bushes that snagged at his clothes and scratched his arms. The air grew cooler here, away from the open creek, and the woods felt older, the trees thicker and more menacing. With every step, his hope grew into a near certainty. This path would lead to a hidden cabin, an old logging road, a beer can-littered hideout, some logical explanation for the sophisticated, cruel prank being played on him. But after nearly an hour of pushing deeper into the forest, the trail ended. It didn't peter out. It stopped abruptly, running straight into a dense, impenetrable thicket of thorn bushes and tangled vines. A solid wall of green and brown that was impossible to pass. It was a literal and metaphorical dead end. Frustrated and sweating, he turned to go back, and that's when he saw it. It was the only thing he would find. Snagged on a thick, gnarled root that snaked out of the earth like a grasping claw was an old, weathered child's shoe. It was a little girl's shoe, a tiny leather Mary Jane, the kind you might see in a faded photograph from generations ago. The leather was cracked and covered in a film of green moss. The buckle rusted a deep, angry orange. It looked like it had been there for 50 years, slowly being consumed by the forest. The sight of it added a new layer of dread and mystery to his situation. Pranksters didn't leave behind ancient, heartbreaking relics. This didn't fit. This felt wrong. It felt like evidence of a genuine tragedy, a sorrow so old it had become part of the forest itself, a quiet horror that completely undermined his rational theories. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crept down his spine. He backed away slowly, leaving the shoe where it lay, feeling as if he had stumbled upon a tiny, forgotten grave. The woods no longer felt mischievous. They felt hungry. Back at his camp, the chilling image of the child's shoe haunted him. He tried to push it from his mind, telling himself it was nothing, a sad, random piece of litter. He focused instead on his task, driven by a renewed, almost manic energy. He decided to reinforce his makeshift alarm system. While rigging his alarms, he fumbled in his pack for his multi-tool to crimp a small metal sinker onto the fishing line. The familiar, solid feel of the multi-tool Clara had given him for his last birthday, the way the pliers opened with a soft, oiled click, was the trigger. It was a second, more painful flashback, one he spent every waking moment trying to suppress. The dark forest dissolved, replaced by the bright sunlit kitchen of their apartment. It was the morning of her accident. Coffee was brewing, its rich aroma filling the air, and the news was murmuring from a small television on the counter. It was a perfectly ordinary morning, which was what made the memory so unbearable. He remembered her standing by the counter, holding a white envelope, her brow furrowed in frustration. "Did you see this bill from the mechanic?" she had asked, her voice tight. "It's twice what they quoted us for the brakes." He had barely looked up from his phone, scrolling through an endless feed of pointless news. "I know, I saw it," he'd mumbled. "I'll handle it." Her sigh was heavy with a familiar weariness. "That's what you said last week, Leo. It's due tomorrow. You can't just handle it in your head. It has to actually get paid." He'd felt a flash of irritation at her tone at the interruption. "I said I'll handle it. Why don't you trust me to do one thing?" "Because you're not listening," she'd shot back, her voice rising with an emotion he had been too self-absorbed to recognize as desperation. "You're always half here, staring at that screen. I feel like I'm managing everything alone." Their final conversation was not a dramatic, tear-filled fight. It was petty, a stupid, unresolved argument about money and attention, the kind of mundane friction that happens in any shared life. But because it was their last, its smallness had become monstrous. He had mumbled something dismissive, something about being busy. She had stood there for a moment, waiting for him to look up, but he never did. He just heard her grab her keys from the hook by the door. "I have to go, or I'll be late," she'd said, her back to him. And then she was gone. The sound of her car starting in the driveway was the last thing he ever heard from her. The memory shattered, and he was back in the woods, the multi-tool clutched in his white-knuckled hand, his cheeks wet with tears he hadn't realized he was crying. The weight of that unresolved moment, of his petty anger and her final unheard plea for connection was crushing. This memory was the key to his being here, the engine of his obsession. The flashback deepened his guilt tenfold, explaining his desperate need for this trip to mean something. He had to endure this ordeal, to see it through to its end. This trip couldn't just be for her anymore. It had to be a penance, a grand, terrible gesture to make up for a final conversation that had meant absolutely nothing. The second night found Leo not in his sleeping bag but sitting bolt upright in the center of the tent, a heavy-duty flashlight clutched in his hand like a weapon. He didn't even try to sleep. He was waiting. He sat in the suffocating dark, his back rigid, his ears straining to parse every tiny sound that filtered through the thin nylon walls. The whisper of wind through the pines, the ceaseless, rhythmic chirping of crickets, the far-off hoot of an owl. He was a scientist at his post, an observer waiting for data. He was a terrified man waiting for the monster to show its face. For hours, there was nothing but the normal nighttime symphony of the forest. Then, around 3 a.m., it happened. It wasn't a sound, but the absolute absence of it. The cricket chorus, which had been a constant, unwavering wall of sound, ceased in an instant, cut off as if by a switch. The wind died. The forest fell utterly still. An unnatural, profound silence descended upon the woods, a dead air so heavy and absolute that it felt like a physical pressure building against his eardrums. The world had gone deaf. Leo held his breath, every muscle tensed, waiting. He heard nothing. He saw nothing. But then he felt it. It began not as a pull or a jolt, but as a subtle shift in equilibrium, a dizzying sensation of weightlessness. He felt the tent begin to move, not dragged or pushed, but carried along in a smooth, sickening, frictionless glide. It was a silent, effortless motion, like a boat on a perfectly still, black lake, and the feeling of it was a deep and fundamental violation of the laws of physics as he understood them. Heart hammering against his ribs, he scrambled to the mesh window and looked out. The sight was a waking nightmare. He watched the familiar, solid shapes of the trees drift past his window with a slow, stately grace, their dark trunks sliding by in the gloom. The blackened circle of his fire pit, his one anchor to a sane world, seemed to slide away into the darkness, receding from him. His eyes darted desperately to the cooler where his makeshift alarm of cans sat, perfectly still and silent. The fishing line he had so carefully strung was slack, undisturbed. His alarms had failed completely. They hadn't just failed to trigger, the event was of a nature that they could not detect. The glide lasted for less than a minute, a terrifying eternity, before the tent settled as gently as it had begun, now in a new, unknown part of the darkness. In that moment, Leo's carefully constructed world of logic and reason collapsed into dust. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a dream. The threat was confirmed, in the most undeniable way possible, to be real and terrifyingly supernatural. The immediate aftermath was almost as terrifying as the event itself. The moment the movement stopped, the sounds of the forest rushed back in, a sudden and chaotic wave of noise. The crickets resumed their chirping, their song now sounding like a mocking, relentless jeer. The sheer normalcy of it made the profound, unnatural silence that had preceded it even more horrifying. For a long moment, Leo didn't move. He was paralyzed, a statue of pure shock in the center of his small, relocated world, the silent glide still echoing in his bones. Then, a surge of adrenaline. The phone, the data. With trembling hands that felt like clumsy foreign objects, he grabbed his phone from its perch. He stopped the recording and immediately stabbed at the playback button, his breath held tight in his chest. The footage began, perfect and stable. The grainy night vision showed the dark, still clearing, the cold fire pit, the silent cans on the cooler. He watched, his knuckles white, as the timestamp ticked towards the moment of the event. Then, at the exact second he remembered the silence beginning, the video dissolved into a screen of hissing, rolling static. A loud, roaring hiss filled the small tent, a violent, angry noise for what had been a completely silent event. The chaotic, meaningless pattern on the screen was a digital scream, a visual representation of a broken reality. The static continued for a full, agonizing minute before the footage snapped back to a clear, stable image of the forest, now showing a different, unfamiliar view from the tent's new position. The technology had failed. His alarms had failed. Every single one of his logical preparations, his carefully constructed defenses against the impossible, had been utterly useless. The complete failure of his experiment shattered his composure. A sound escaped his throat, a choked, desperate noise that was half a sob and half a laugh. He was a fool. An arrogant fool who had tried to measure an earthquake with a ruler, who had tried to put a leash on a god. He felt a distinct snap in his mind, the sound of a thread being pulled too taut. His sanity began to fray. He scrambled to his feet and began pacing the 2 steps that the confines of the small tent allowed, his hands tangled in his hair like he was trying to hold his own head together. He started whispering to himself, the words tumbling out in a frantic, broken stream. No, no, no. It's not possible. It's just not possible. The whispers grew louder, addressed now to the oppressive darkness outside. What are you? What do you want from me? He felt watched. The woods were no longer a neutral collection of trees. They were a single, conscious entity, and he was a tiny insect trapped in its web. He was utterly alone, adrift in an ocean of the impossible, and the last compass he had, his own rational mind, was beginning to spin wildly, no longer pointing true north. As the adrenaline from his discovery faded, it was replaced by a cold and creeping paranoia. Every shadow seemed to lengthen and deepen with unnatural speed as dusk settled. Leo retreated into his tent, zipping the flap shut, but it offered no comfort. The thin nylon walls felt more like a cage than a shelter. He felt a constant prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the undeniable feeling of being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. The natural sounds of the evening forest, which had once been a comfort, now seemed menacing. Every snapping twig was a footstep. Every rustle of leaves was something crawling just beyond the light of his lantern. Then, the wind picked up. It wasn't a storm, just a steady, mournful rush of air that made the ancient pines outside moan and the tent fabric ripple and snap. And in the sound of the wind, Leo started hearing things. At first, they were faint, easily dismissed as tricks of the air. But, as his paranoia set in, the sounds became more distinct, coalescing out of the random noise. He began to hear faint whispers that were almost words, sibilant sounds that rode the currents of the air. A long, low hiss of wind moving through the branches would resolve, for just a second, into something that sounded chillingly like his name. Lily. A gust rattling the leaves would sound, for a terrifying instant, like a crowd of people murmuring just beyond the clearing. The sounds would mimic the cadence of human voices, rising and falling like questions and answers, but the words themselves remained just out of reach, a maddening phantom language. He spent hours like that, huddled in his tent, wrapped tightly in his sleeping bag as if for protection. He became a statue of fear, his entire being focused on a single horrifying task. Listening to the forest talk to him. He didn't move. He barely breathed. He was no longer a scientist with a plan. He was a terrified receiver, tuned to a horrifying cosmic station that he couldn't turn off. The true horror was his own internal conflict, his inability to distinguish reality from his fracturing mind. It's just the wind. A part of his brain, the logical engineer insisted. Auditory pareidolia. The brain creating patterns from random noise because you're exhausted and terrified. But then another gust would sweep through the camp, carrying a sound that was so perfectly shaped like a questioning whisper, so close to his tent, that the logical part of him would shrink back in terror. But it sounded so real, the other part of him would argue, the part that was now in control. It sounded like it knew you were in here. It's looking for you. He was losing the ability to trust his own senses, his most valuable tool. Was the forest truly whispering to him, or was this the sound of his own mind breaking apart under the impossible strain? He didn't know. And in the deep, oppressive darkness of the woods, either possibility was equally terrifying. Leo didn't sleep. He lay awake through the long, whispering hours until the first gray, unforgiving light of the third day filtered through the tent. The whispers, real or imagined, had eroded the last of his composure, wearing away his sanity like water on stone. He had been pushed to his breaking point. The meticulous scientist was gone, replaced by a terrified animal driven by a single, overwhelming instinct: flight. He had to get out. Now. He abandoned his experiment without a second thought. The carefully smoothed dirt, the silent camera, the undisturbed fishing line alarms, all of it was a monument to his own foolishness, and he couldn't stand to look at it. He scrambled out of the tent and made a frantic dash to pack his truck. There was no order, no precision to his movements. He ripped the stakes of his tent from the ground with raw strength, not caring when one of them tore a long, gaping hole in the nylon fabric. He threw his gear into the bed of the truck with a series of loud, desperate clangs and thuds that felt obscene in the morning quiet. His sleeping bag, his stove, his cooler, all of it was just junk in the way of his escape, obstacles between him and the sanity of a paved road. Finally, it was done. He scrambled into the driver's seat, slamming the heavy door shut, the sound a final, defiant punctuation mark. The familiar interior of the truck was a sanctuary, a capsule of civilization smelling of old coffee and gasoline. For a single, beautiful second, a wave of powerful relief washed over him. He was safe. He was leaving. He jammed the key into the ignition, a prayer on his lips. He turned the key, anticipating the familiar, comforting roar of the engine. Nothing. Nothing but a dead, hollow click. The sound was tiny, insignificant, yet it echoed in the cab like a gunshot that signaled the death of all hope. His heart seized in his chest. "No," he whispered, his voice a dry croak. "No, no, please." He tried again. Click, and again. Click, click, click. The frantic, pathetic sound was the only reply. He pumped the gas pedal, a useless, desperate gesture of a drowning man. He twisted the key with so much force he thought it would snap off in his hand. But there was only the same deadening, final click. The engine was dead. He stopped, letting his hands fall from the key. His forehead came to rest against the cold plastic of the steering wheel. He stared out the windshield at the silent, watching trees that surrounded him on all sides. There was no way out. The truck, his last hope, his mobile piece of the real world, was just another part of the exhibit now. The realization settled over him, cold and absolute. His physical escape was now impossible. He was trapped. Trapped and terrified. Leo stumbled out of the dead truck and walked back to his ruined campsite. The torn tent, the scattered gear, it all looked like the aftermath of a struggle he had already lost. There was no plan now, no experiment, no hope of a logical explanation. There was only the waiting. He was forced to endure the final day. He sank down onto a log near his cold fire pit and did the only thing he could do. He watched the woods. He didn't move from his campsite all day. He just sat there, a prisoner in a green jail, as the sun made its agonizingly slow journey across the sky. Time seemed to warp and stretch, each minute an hour, each hour an eternity of quiet, suffocating tension. He didn't eat. He barely drank. He was a condemned man, and the setting of the sun would be his executioner. He simply sat and listened to the forest breathe around him. As he watched, the forest began to change in his perception. It no longer felt like a place. It felt like a thing. The forest now felt alive, a single, vast, predatory organism, and he was the foreign body it was slowly preparing to digest. The wind in the leaves wasn't just wind. It was the sound of the beast's slow, steady breathing. The deep shadows under the ferns weren't just shadows. They were the spaces where its hidden parts lay coiled, waiting for the light to fade completely. The caw of a distant crow sounded like a verdict being passed down. His terrified mind, now completely untethered from rational thought, began to project his fear onto the landscape. He started to see shapes in the shadows. Out of the corner of his eye, the twisted form of a fallen branch would look, for a heart-stopping second, like a crouching, emaciated figure, its head cocked as if listening. He would snap his head around, his heart leaping into his throat, and it would just be a branch again. The patterns in the bark of the ancient trees seemed to watch him back. Knots became hollow eyes. Cracks in the wood formed into leering, silent mouths. He was surrounded by a silent, unblinking audience of 1,000 wooden faces, a gallery of witnesses to his final hours. This was a slow descent into pure psychological dread as he waited for night to fall. He no longer questioned his sanity. He simply accepted that he was inside a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. He thought of the child's shoe, of the ranger's story of the vanished woman. He wasn't the first. The forest was a collector. As the sun finally began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bloody shades of orange and purple, the shadows grew long and merged together, erasing the lines between what was real and what his fracturing mind was creating. The waiting was over. The night was here. The third night arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, somber surrender. Leo was no longer the frantic animal of the morning, nor the obsessive scientist of the day before. A profound and heavy resignation had settled over him, a calm that was far more terrifying than any panic. Trapped and terrified, he had retreated to his torn tent. As dusk fell, he didn't try to barricade the door or fashion a weapon. Resigned to his fate, Leo sat in the dark and waited. He had left the flap slightly open, a silent admission that hiding was pointless. He didn't hold a flashlight. His hands rested, limp, in his lap. He was a man who knew his time was up, simply waiting for the inevitable to arrive, whatever form it might take. And it did. Around the same time as the night before, the world outside began to go quiet. The cricket song faded, not abruptly this time, but as if being slowly turned down by an unseen hand. The wind died, the leaves fell still. The unnatural silence returned, pressing in on the tent from all sides. This time it did not feel like a surprise attack. It felt like a formal, ceremonial arrival. The stage was being set, the curtain was rising, and he was the only actor. He listened to the crushing silence for a long time, his heart beating a slow, funereal rhythm. Then, a new element was introduced. Something that changed the nature of the horror from cosmic to deeply, intimately personal. It started so softly he was sure it was a memory, a phantom sound created by his grieving mind. But it grew, slowly, steadily, until it was undeniable. It was the soft, rhythmic sound of breathing, and it was coming from directly outside the tent wall, so close he felt he could reach through the nylon and touch the source. It wasn't just any breathing. Every person's sleep has its own unique cadence, its own signature rhythm, and Leo knew this one better than his own. He had fallen asleep to it for nearly a decade. It was the soft, almost silent inhale, followed by a gentle, puffing exhale that always had the slightest whistle to it. It was the exact sound of Clara's breathing as she slept beside him for years. The sound was so perfect, so achingly familiar, that it broke through his resignation and shattered his heart all over again. A single hot tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek, then another. He was frozen, every muscle locked, listening to the ghost of his wife's rest. It was the most comforting and the most terrifying sound he had ever heard in his life. It was a summons, and he had no choice but to listen. Tears streamed down his face, hot and silent, as he listened to the impossible, intimate sound of his wife's breathing. He was so lost in the vortex of his grief and terror that he barely noticed when the movement began again. It started as the familiar, gentle glide, but this time there was no hesitation. It accelerated smoothly, powerfully, and soon the tent began to move faster than ever before. This was not a gentle relocation. This was an abduction. Branches, thick as his arm, scraped and clawed at the nylon walls, producing loud, tearing sounds that spoke of a new, more forceful intent. The floor of the tent jolted and bumped over unseen roots and rocks. Through the mesh window, the familiar woods of the creek were gone, replaced by a blurred, chaotic vision of massive, ancient tree trunks rushing past in the gloom. The tent was being pulled deep into the impenetrable darkness of the old-growth forest. And as he was pulled deeper into the darkness, the why was revealed to him. It did not come in words, but as a feeling, a wave of information and raw emotion that washed over him, bypassing his ears and flowing directly into the core of his being. He felt the consciousness of the thing that was moving him, and its primary overwhelming quality was a profound and ancient loneliness. It was not the sharp, painful loneliness of a human, but a loneliness on a geological scale. The vast, patient emptiness of millennia spent watching and waiting in silence. It was the loneliness of a god. He felt this immense, ancient loneliness of the forest turn its full, undivided attention to him, and he felt it recognize his own small, sharp grief. It had sensed his grief as a familiar echo, a tiny, frantic spark of the same dark energy that it was made of. He understood, then, in a moment of terrible clarity, that this wasn't an act of malice. In a way that was far more horrifying, it was an act of corrupted empathy. The entity was offering a twisted comfort. It was a promise to end his pain, to silence his screaming memories forever by taking him somewhere he could be with his grief, and with it, forever. The destination was a place of quiet, a place of absorption, where his individual sorrow would be dissolved into the greater, eternal sorrow of the woods. He would cease to be Leo. He would simply be. The absolute terror of this offer was matched only by a small, treacherous part of him that found it beautiful, that yearned for the final, quiet release it promised. The tent continued its inexorable pull into the forest's heart, and Leo was faced with the ultimate choice. A part of him, a deeply exhausted, broken part, felt the seductive pull of the forest's offer. He could just stop. He could surrender to the sorrow, let it finally consume him, and join the silence. He could let go of the pain, the guilt, the constant aching weight of her absence. The forest offered an end to it all, a quiet oblivion that felt, in that moment, like a profound mercy. He could be with the memory of Clara, a sad, silent ghost in a sad, silent wood. But another part of him, a small, stubborn spark that had been buried under months of grief, fought back. It was the part that remembered the taste of coffee on a cold morning, the warmth of the sun on maybe Bring, his face, the sound of a favorite song on the radio. It was the part of him that knew this offer of comfort was a lie, an erasure of everything he had ever been, of everything they had been together. It was a choice between becoming a silent, sorrowful memory or fighting to live. As he teetered on this knife's edge of decision, the memory of his unresolved argument with Clara flooded his mind, sharp and painfully clear. He saw her back as she walked out the door. He heard his own dismissive, angry words hanging in the air of their kitchen. For months, that memory had been a source of pure, corrosive guilt, a wound that would not heal. But now, in this final moment, it gave him the strength he needs. He realized that to surrender now, to fade away into this lonely silence, would be the ultimate cowardice. It would mean their story, all their laughter, their struggles, their love, would forever end on that one petty, unresolved note. Truly honoring her wasn't about joining her in death. It was about living with the weight of her life, and finally saying the goodbye he was never able to, The guilt transformed into a responsibility. The realization was a surge of fire in his veins. He took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with the cold, damp air of the moving tent. He opened his mouth and screamed her name into the darkness, not with the longing of a grieving husband pleading for a ghost, but with the wrenching finality of a man closing a door forever. "Clara, I love you, but I have to let you go." The words, raw and torn from the deepest part of his soul, echoed through the silent woods. At this moment of pure catharsis, as the last echo of her name faded into the ancient trees, the impossible movement of the tent stopped. It didn't slow down. It ceased instantly, with a jolt that threw him forward onto his hands. The connection was severed. The presence was gone. And for the first time in a long time, the silence that followed felt truly empty. The next morning, the first light of dawn found Leo in a part of the forest he had never seen, the air still and cool. He emerged from the tent feeling scoured out, exhausted and emotionally hollowed out. The catharsis of the night before had left him empty but also strangely calm. There was no more fear, only a vast, quiet ache where his grief used to be. He didn't know the way back, but he walked with a strange sense of purpose, following the rising sun through the dense, unfamiliar woods. After an hour of pushing through the undergrowth, he broke through a line of ferns and saw it. His truck, sitting exactly where he had left it, a metal anomaly in the ancient landscape. He walked to his truck, his movements slow and deliberate. He got in, the familiar seat a strange comfort. He didn't expect it to work, but on a desperate whim he turned the key in the ignition. With a violent, sputtering cough that seemed to shake the silence of the entire forest, the engine roared to life. He didn't pause to think or to question the miracle. He didn't wait to pack the tent or any of his other gear. He put the truck in drive and fled, leaving everything behind for the forest to reclaim. Hours later, he was on the highway, the truck eating up the miles of clean black asphalt. Cars and other trucks passed him, their drivers living in a world that no longer seemed entirely real to him. He was a man returning from a foreign country, a traveler who had seen things that had no place in this sane, sunlit world of rules and combustion engines. The forest was now just a distant, dark green line on the horizon behind him. He glanced in his rearview mirror, a final, almost involuntary check. For just a single heart-stopping second, he saw the impossible. He saw the entire forest on the horizon sway, not in ripples from the wind, but as a single organism. The whole tree line dipped and rose in one fluid, silent motion, a slow, haunting goodbye. It was a final acknowledgement, a sign that it knew he was gone and that it was letting him go. He snapped his eyes back to the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. He knew then that he has survived, but he is forever scarred. He had faced the abyss, and it had, in its own way, waved back. The world was now a bigger and much more terrifying place. The story ends here, but the nightmare, perhaps, has just found a new home. What do you think the forest truly wanted? Was it an evil entity? Or was it just lonely? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. I read every single one. If this tale left a chill down your spine, the greatest way to support the channel is to hit the like button, subscribe to Horror Stories Audio, and ring the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss our weekly descent into madness. Sharing this experience with a fellow horror enthusiast is the best way to help our community of fear grow. Until next time, be careful of the silence. It's never truly empty. Sleep well.